So I think we can just start and let people come in as we develop the conversation. So I'm just going to start a little bit explaining what's the idea of the webinar series and then kind of the mechanics for this conversation. So this is part of the Yes to Live, No to Mining. So this conversation is part of the year-round also Ecological Law and Governance Association webinar series, which is in partnership with the following groups and associations. So first, the Ethics Specialist Group, the World Commission on Environmental Law, the Australian Earth Law Alliance, the Center for Environmental Ethics, the Earth Law Center, the Economics for the Anthropocene and the Leadership for the Ecozoic at McGill. My name is Ivan Vargas. I'm a PhD student at McGill University. I'm also working on issues of extractivism and indigenous rights in the Colombian Amazon. It's my pleasure to be joining this conversation today with you. So this conversation is also part of the international webinar series, Life After Mining, How Do We Move Beyond Extractivism, which is hosted by the Yes to Live, No to Mining Worldwide Initiative. This conversation will explore, among others, emerging understandings of post-extractivism and colonialism, and how different communities in North America and beyond have stopped mining and other extractive industries while building alternatives that support rather than destroy human communities and the systems we all depend on. So first, some housekeeping announcements before we start. Please use the sign-up sheet, which is going to be posted soon in the Google Doc through the Zoom, through the chat function, so that we can all provide some information about future events of the series and enhance our network. Also, please feel free to post your questions and comments using the chat function as well. We will do our best to approach those questions and comments after the presentations today. Also, feel free to intervene directly if you wish. So after the presentations, we will have a free-flowing conversation with the speakers around the following questions. What is post-extractivism? What does a post-extractivist economy look like? How do communities you work with are protecting or building regenerative rather than extractive systems? So we will start first with Dr. Professor Hilary Hoffman, from the Vermont Law School. So Professor Hoffman teaches legislation and regulation, natural resource law, Native American law, and administrative law at the Vermont Law School. Professor Hoffman's scholarship addresses the systems governing natural resource use and allocation on public lands and tribal lands, and cultural resource protection on federal, state, and tribal lands. Her recent articles explore the strengths and limitations of federalism, both in the context of tribal regulatory authority over natural resources, and more broadly as a means of ensuring that democratic principles guide public natural resource management decisions across all categories of federal public lands. So please welcome me in joining Professor Hoffman for 25 minutes of her presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Yvonne, and thank you to the event organizers and sponsors. I wanted to thank Jeff, who is not with us, but Jeff Garver from McGill University has been instrumental in organizing this webinar series. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to try to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint. So the topic of this particular webinar really intrigued me because I think, after year of teaching natural resources law, which is very much, I'm so glad that we're talking about the aspect of colonialism and the colonialist structure of existing laws, because the law that I teach right now is essentially colonial natural resources law. And I think that the post-extractivism, whatever comes in the future, will be something different and will incorporate more diverse voices and perspectives and or at least that's my hope. I sometimes, when I'm teaching natural resources law, there are so many different laws that govern particularly mining that I find it hard to envision how the US system might transition away from extractivism. But I think conversations like this are the place that starts. And so I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. One place that I think that mining reform could start in the United States is with energy minerals. So I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about the way that we define energy minerals under US law. So coal, oil, and natural gas are the primary sources of energy generation in the United States. And I put uranium at the end with a question mark because some scholars say that uranium is an energy mineral, but others say that it should be categorized in the group of hard rock minerals because of its properties. So anyway, for today's purposes, I'm gonna group it as an energy mineral. So energy minerals, as it says there, is this general category used to describe those minerals that are used somewhere in the process of producing energy. Under current US law, energy mineral extraction is regulated throughout the entire mining life cycle, which I'll get into in a second, and often by different statutes depending on the stage of the mining cycle, which can make this kind of a complex area of law. This also makes mining reform, unless it's done kind of across the board, it makes it difficult to achieve, and that it's part of the reason why in the United States that after decades and decades of attempts, the oldest and perhaps maybe worst of our mining laws, the general mining law, which has been in effect since 1897, is still good law in the United States and has not been reformed, despite large legislative efforts and lobbying efforts primarily from environmental groups over the past several decades to reform it. So if we take the sources of US electricity, you can see from this visual that over time, coal, natural gas, and oil have sort of competed to be the primary sources of electric energy generation in the United States, and the percentages have varied over time, but those three have been the big ones down at the bottom of the graph, with the renewable resources up at the top in those thin bands that you can see: solar, wind, geothermal, and hydropower. So if we look at an electricity generation breakdown from last year, so from 2018 in the United States, coal, oil, and natural gas were the sources of 63% of the net electricity generation. That's the power that's generated outward for consumption by the general public. Uranium, which powers nuclear power plants, was roughly 20%, and then renewables came in at 17% in the United States. So the mining laws can be organized in a couple of different ways, but one way that you can organize them and think about them is through the mining life cycle. So you can see this graph that depicts the various stages of the mining cycle, the life cycle of a mine, and then you can think about how to organize the different laws in each one of those phases of mining. So I think that's kind of a helpful way to organize the mining laws, and that's the way that I teach them. However, a different way of organizing them could be by the mineral itself and then where it's located, because that also lends to, it's a complex, but you can see sort of symmetrical way of organizing the mining laws. So it looks like so I have, for instance, publicly owned oil and gas, different laws in the United States. So publicly owned oil and gas located on federal lands would be regulated differently than privately owned coal located on somebody's private property in whichever state it's located. And then, of course, tribal governments have a sovereign authority to regulate mineral development on tribal lands. And so sometimes there's a complex set of laws that govern mineral extraction on tribal land that are a combination of federal statutes and then relevant tribal laws that have been passed. Tribes also have the sovereign authority to ban mineral extraction on their tribal lands. And in fact, about a handful of tribes that I know of have begun passing bans on fracking and other forms of extraction of minerals from tribal lands in the US. But you can see that the location, the type, the status or category of the land in which the mineral is located, and then the mineral type can also be determinative in the United States. So I thought we could just take a deep dive into one particular mineral so that we can see sort of how this works under US law. So I chose uranium located on federal public lands. So these are some of the laws that I grouped into the 4 stages of the mining life cycle. So acquisition, how you acquire the right to mine uranium, then development at sort of the planning stages of what type of mine is this going to be. Is it going to be a surface mine? Is it going to involve in situ leaching techniques and be underground? Then in the extraction and production, that's when the mineral is actually coming out of the ground. And that is when, if I back up for a second, in the development phase, there might be planning statutes like the Endangered Species Act that a relevant federal agency that's permitting this mine might need to think about. So if there's an endangered species present, then the agency would have to protect the habitat of that species when it's deciding whether to grant or deny the permit for the uranium mine, or whether to grant or deny the plan or of operations is really the parlance, the mining law parlance. And then in the extraction or production phase, the general mining law, which is that sort of grandfather of mining statutes on federal public lands in the United States, that would continue to apply. But then if there were issues with disposal of mining waste or tailings, if there were issues surrounding any kinds of leaks or anything, spills or unexpected events like that, then other statutes like the Clean Water Act might kick in and start to regulate the mining activities. And then, of course, at the end is the reclamation phase. And so that's when the mine is being abandoned because it's no longer feasible to extract the mineral, or the mineral has all been depleted. And so therefore, and on federal public lands, this is a really big problem. The reclamation phase is governed by very few laws. So the general mining law that required a certain plan of operations also would have required a bond before mining began. But then at the end, sometimes that bond doesn't end up being enough for the mine operator to be able to actually complete the cleanup costs. And so some mines are abandoned before reclamation is completed. And then what happens is there's just a giant environmental disaster that has to be cleaned up by someone. And then that's where statutes like the Comprehensive Environmental Reclamation, well, it's CERCLA, that's the Superfund statute. It's got the longest name of all of the federal environmental statutes, I think, anyway. So that's where a statute like that would kick in and say, and would assign liability and responsibility to clean up and reclaim the land that was used to develop a mine after mining has ended or is completed. And again, if I back up, that's just sort of a handful of statutes that I picked that are common ones, but there might be, depending on the circumstances, there might be more statutes that would apply during the development and extraction phase. Certainly the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the act that requires the preparation of an environmental impact statement, that might be triggered if the mine is big enough and has a significant impact on the environment or on human health. So that's another one to be mindful of. So then if we break down the mining life cycle a little bit more and take a look at the general mining law, this is a statute that still to this day allows for mineral prospecting on lands that are open for this activity. So there are certain public lands in the United States that are theoretically the public property of all Americans, that through a federal agency designation, marking those lands as open means that anyone could go out onto the land and stake a claim for a mineral like uranium. So uranium primarily occurs in two geological formations, which can sometimes dictate the method of extraction. And that has to do with the depth of the uranium ore and how far away it is from the surface. Sometimes uranium can be found at the surface, and I think I have a slide next that shows that. But if evidence of uranium is found, the prospector can stake a claim. So originally this, if any of you are fans of old Western movies, you might have seen the prospector with the satchel and the stakes going out and actually physically putting stakes in the ground. And that's still to this day an acceptable form of essentially arguably privatizing federal land for the purpose of mineral development. So that's a very controversial aspect of the general mining law. But then the size of the claim that's staked and the maximum size depends on the type of method that will be used. So I have, I don't know if you can see this online, but I have this example of, this is a breccia pipe formation of uranium that you can see. This is in the American Southwest. I think this actually might be on the Havasupai reservation. So this is a bad example in the sense that this would, if it's on tribal land, it would be governed by a different set of regulations, but at least it's a visual depicting what uranium-bearing formation might look like on federal public lands. So in the development phase, the mining operation has to be planned and there has to be a plan submitted to the relevant federal agency, which in this case is the Bureau of Land Management, which has to be kept informed at the beginning and then during mining and at the conclusion of mining. Depending on the size of the mining operation, the BLM may need to conduct a review of environmental consequences under the statute that I had mentioned previously, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And then this planning phase may invoke other laws depending on the size of the operation and whether it will require building new access roads or other infrastructure like on-site milling. So uranium has to be milled. The ore that's extracted has to be processed and turned into the yellow cake that's used to make the pellets that are put into the nuclear fuel rods. And that requires a processing or milling operation. Sometimes, but only rarely, that's done on site at the mine, but usually the uranium has to be transported elsewhere for processing. Then the extraction phase, this is when the minerals are actually brought out of the ground. So for publicly mined uranium on federal lands, the general mining law would continue to impose what I would argue are minimal requirements at this stage. The agency kind of oversees the operations and generally makes sure that the operation is continuing according to the plan that had been submitted, but operations like this on federal public lands are not supervised at the level that one might think, especially given the oversight that agencies like the EPA have of like a coal-fired power plant, for example. Those are monitored intensively on a daily basis, sometimes on a more frequent basis by agencies like the EPA, whereas mining operations are sort of a periodic let's send somebody out there, see if everything looks okay, and then, you know, they drive away and might not be seen for months. So at this stage, at the extraction stage, is really where the environmental laws start to kick in a little bit more in this process. So the laws like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, that many of you might have heard about, will start to govern the mining activity, especially if something goes wrong, more than the property-based statute, which is the general mining law. So if you think about the formation that I just showed you a couple of slides ago, then I just pulled up this picture of a uranium mine in the Southwest. You can see that what happens to that formation during the development and extraction process is that it can be turned into something like this. So it's an intensive hard rock mining and energy mineral development are incredibly environmentally taxing, sometimes culturally taxing. Some of my research and writing is about the impact that these activities have on the cultural resources of indigenous peoples of the United States. And you can see that there's just mass destruction and devastation that happens when one of these mines is developed on a scale that it's really hard to understand unless you have seen it with your own eyes. So I would encourage any of you who are interested in mining and the impacts of mining to go and see a hard rock mine or a fracking pad. So reclamation is the final stage of the life cycle, and as I said here, estimates vary, but there might be up to 500,000 abandoned hard rock mines in the United States. So that includes some uranium mines, but also silver, gold, and other hard minerals. Reclamation is governed by the requirements of the original mining plan. It's supervised by the BLM, and then it's regulated by the environmental pollution control statutes like CERCLA or the Clean Water Act if things go wrong. Uranium, I chose, and maybe the speaker after me is going to address this, I'm not sure, but uranium is particularly problematic because the tailings are radioactive. And so the tailings that are produced when the uranium ore is processed need to be disposed of very carefully, and the mine reclamation that takes place needs to be done in a very specific way. So if the mine runs out of money or if something else goes wrong, it can be disastrous for communities that are living near those mill sites, and sometimes those communities don't even know actually that this activity is taking place or the level of harm that they might expect. Oh, this is kind of a fuzzy picture. This didn't really turn out very well, but I brought 10 of my students out to Southern Utah in March for a course that I just developed this year at Vermont Law School that is looking at the levels of protection on federal public lands and then tribal rights in federal public lands. And so this is one of the sites that's a reclaimed, or it's a uranium mine that is right along the banks of the Colorado River. You can see, probably barely see this this muddy looking river over here to the left is the mighty Colorado, which is flowing right by this old uranium site that is still being reclaimed decades after mining operations ceased. And it's been a real disaster for the surrounding communities to live with. Anyway, I just thought I would show you that, even though it's kind of fuzzy, you can see the sort of scale and the level of cleanup that's required at one of these sites. So what would be some possibilities for the new model? So I've talked a lot about the existing model for energy mineral development and used that specific example of uranium. I think a lot about this, actually, so I'm so glad that that you asked me to speak. in this webinar because there have been so many suggestions about how to reform mining law and policy in the United States, and to date, none of them have been successful, except in the 1930s when when oil and gas were a leasing system was developed for oil and gas, and so corporations could no longer privatize that public resource. But historically, energy mineral demand in the US anyway, and especially on public lands, has been driven by the energy markets. So other natural resources that I teach about in my classes, like for instance, public forage for domestic livestock. The demand for grazing allotments on public land doesn't tend to decrease even when there's no grass. So ranchers still want to obtain the rights to graze dry desert allotments, they're called, just because it's part of the sort of cultural fabric of their lives and their family histories. Whereas with mining, the corporations are driven, they're profit driven. And so the demand for energy minerals is really going to be, I think, a primary driver of any mining reform that takes place in this area. So I think it'll require the market to shift either through top-down mechanisms like law reform and increased regulation, or perhaps through bottom-up mechanisms where the public becomes so outraged at the environmental externalities and the cultural and other impacts of activities like mining that there's a demand for change, and then either the federal agencies change their policies or the legislatures act to change the laws. And I think, you know, maybe I shouldn't say if those shifts take place, but I should say when those shifts take place. I think legal reform has to accompany them or follow them, but I think it really has to accompany them. And the legal reform has to address the different categories of minerals and their location for it to be really and truly comprehensive and effective. So I've listed out some of the laws where I think there might be a call for reform. You know, if it's, and this is again just limited to uranium, so you could go mineral by mineral and list out everything that needs to be reformed, or you could go location by location and list out, you know, certain categories of minerals together. But it really will need to be a comprehensive strategy of legal reform. And I don't know that it would be possible, given the complexity of mining law in the US, to reform using one federal statute or one model state statute. But I might be wrong, so I'd be open to comments about that. Also, in the new model, if we think about mining more broadly, it's not just energy minerals that we're pulling out of the ground in the United States. And this is, again, I'm just focusing on the United States, but obviously there's a global market for minerals. So it's worth thinking about the impacts to the global economy and to those who are burdened by mining activities in other countries. But in the US, I just wanted to include this slide because I sometimes wonder, and I ask my students this a lot, are we ready for a complete divestiture from mining? So most of my students in natural resources say that mining is a bad thing and they want to get rid of mining. But then, you know, they're on their cell phone in class typing away, you know, doing whatever they're doing on Twitter or Facebook. And, you know, we're on our computers here today talking to each other, and these devices and even, you know, things like electric cars and batteries and the components of our smartphones and our computers, those require minerals. So lithium is one that I just wanted to plant in people's minds because lithium is required for a lot of electronics, appliances, smart cars, and things that we think of as clean technologies. But when you go back to the source of those technologies, you can see that they're not actually that clean, and that extracting something like lithium from the ground is a very dirty, messy, and impactful process. So that's my sort of food for thought as we develop the new model. I thought I would end with a picture of the Silver Peak lithium mine. This is the only currently licensed lithium mine in the United States. It's located in Nevada. And this is kind of a hot issue right now in hard rock mining because there's a proposal to dramatically increase the size of the Silver Peak mine, which, as you can see, is already pretty massive. So, you know, as demand for these newer, clean, arguably clean technologies increases, then we really do need to think about the minerals that are required to fuel this transformation. So that's the end of my presentation, and I think I'm supposed to wait until, oh, I went over time also, I'm sorry. But I think we're gonna do questions at the end, right? Is that right?
Yeah, but I think that since the presentation was, it's already fresh, I think it would be better for us to engage in a couple of questions before going to the next presentation. So anybody feel free just to jump in, since we're a very small group for today.
Sure, I have a question. I've been looking at mine reclamation in Australia and in Canada a little bit as well. So I was interested whether there's the same kind of, there's a bit of a push at the moment coming from the government level because there's concern over state liability for poorly kind of rehabilitated mines and so forth. So there's actually kind of a bit of a push to change regulation, particularly in relation to reclamation and rehabilitation of mine sites. I wondered if that was the same in the US.
Well, the very short answer to that question is no. There's really, there's not any, especially given the current administration, there's really no call for improving mine reclamation at all. So the efforts to kind of improve the reclamation process are largely coming from the legislature. So from members of Congress and members of the Senate that are concerned about the impacts of these abandoned mines on nearby communities. So there are a few really vocal advocates, especially in the House, that are pushing for some reform along those lines, but there's nothing, I wouldn't call it sort of a general governmental call for better methods of cleaning up and reclaiming old mines.
Interesting. Cool, thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I think there are a lot of elements there that we need to discuss carefully. For instance, this relationship between legislation and colonialism, especially in places where mining sites overlap with indigenous territories, and how mining is seen from an indigenous standpoint. And also you're pointing to this question about the need for minerals and the possibilities of transitioning into something different, and whether we are ready as a modern society to totally divest from an extractive-based economy. And I think those are key questions to consider, and I think that's also challenging the law in opening up to questions beyond the discipline. And thank you so much for pointing to those questions as well. So we're going to continue with the next presenter. Our next presenter is Dr. Andrew Curley from the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Dr. Curley is part of the DINE community. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina. And his current work focuses on indigenous geography, lands, resources, energy, and water rights, also trivial sovereignty and DINE studies. He has done extensive research on coal mining in the Navajo DINE Nation, and his current work is about indigenous geography, resource conflicts, energy, water rights, land, tribal sovereignty, and DINE studies. So please welcome him for this presentation, and thank you for joining us today, Professor Curley.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. And I'm glad that I'm following up on the previous presentation because I think it did a really good job at setting up contextually what I hope to address here in my presentation. First, let me ask, can everybody see my screen?
Yes,
Really
perfect.
great, and you can hear me, I'm assuming. So I'm going to try to be quick through the slides because you know, for sake of my own, I'm running late on something else, so I'll have to leave before the entire presentation is done. So I'm sorry about that. But yeah, so this question about what is a post-extractivism economy and what does that look like? I'm going to look at it from the perspective of tribal communities and nations. So I'm looking at it in the Navajo Nation, you know, the community I come from, Dene Nation, and right now we're presented with this issue of a closing power plant. And so this is a power plant called the Navajo Generating Station. It's a really interesting power plant in that it was majority owned by the Bureau of Reclamation, but also owned in part by different utilities in the area. And this is a common way in which power plant ownership structures exist and look. But in this case, this is the only power plant that the Bureau of Reclamation owned that was a coal-fired power plant. And this power plant was originally meant to to provide the energy to push water from the Colorado River into the Salt River Valley, where Phoenix eventually developed, and down into Tucson, Arizona. So this was through the construction of what's called the Central Arizona Project, CAP, in the mid-1960s. And the Navajo Generating Station was needed in order to provide that energy. Originally, developers wanted to put a hydroelectric dam along the Colorado River just north of the present-day boundaries of the Grand Canyon, and that would generate the electricity needed to push the water upward and then down into the Salt River Valley. But this being one of the first environmental campaigns at the time in an era of conservation thinking was jettisoned for a power plant instead, which was thought of as a better environmental solution at that time, because the idea of climate change and the knowledge of the carbon emissions wasn't as robust in the mid-60s as it is today. And so that's part of the reason why people fail to foresee some of the larger environmental consequences that this power plant would cause. And so, you know, that's something to think about when we're thinking about transition and other kinds of things, is, you know, the limit of our knowledge and how we might be setting ourselves up into problems in the future. And that's something I think that the last presenter was touching on with the last slide. So I think that was a really nice endpoint for me to begin on. Anyway, so the Navajo Generating Station is going to close at the end of this year. It employs about 800 people. It contributes hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues to the tribal government in the form of different kind of leases for the tribe and between the tribe and the owners of the power plant. These are land leases. These are leases for rail and other kinds of lines that are going back and forth. These are leases for with the company who actually is contracted to extract the coal, and that's Peabody Western. I think it's called Peabody Western. It's a subsidy. It's a part of Peabody Corporation. But anyway, so it's a Peabody Western Energy Company, and they pay for land leases as well as water leases for the mining activities within the reservation. So this accounts for about 20%, approximately 20% of the Navajo Nation budget. Non-federal revenues, meaning monies that are not tied to federal expenditures like HUD money. You know, you have limitations on how you can spend that. Those things are part of a different kind of budget for the Navajo Nation. This is just money that's made from leases and from sales taxes and other kinds of revenue generating activities, which then the Navajo Nation could spend on itself and without any kinds of red tape from Washington, D.C. And then these revenues are going to be cut back by 20%, if not more, in the coming years. And this is going to affect the kind of travel programs and services that the Navajo Nation can continue to maintain, everything from scholarships for students to assistance for elderly people living in remote places, to road maintenance and other kinds of things. So it'll have a pretty big impact, an economic impact on the Navajo Nation. And so some of the questions that we should think about, we're talking about extractivism and moving and thinking about a post-extractive economy is who are the people who are going to pay the price for that? And in this case, the Native people who have become incorporated into these colonial relationships with energy production are the ones that are paying the biggest price for the closure of this power plant, and SRP and other utilities relying on other kinds of energy generating and energy sources for their energy generation. And this is primarily natural gas in the form of fracking, which is not an environmentally sustainable mining approach, but it's something that is cheaper than coal is right now. So that's why they're pushing out of coal and closing down these power plants. So some of the things that we want to think about are how development and how these practices of development around and within extractive industries create what people with Native scholars and others are calling colonial entanglements. And I'm borrowing this term from Native anthropologist, Osage anthropologist Jean Dennison, who coined the phrase in her book, I think also called Colonial Entanglements. But it's the idea that there's efforts to try to get towards more sovereignty, to more self-determination, and to use certain kinds of resources around you in order to achieve that. And in some cases, that involves mining and development and things that are part of the extractive economies, which then binds you in other ways and creates other kinds of tensions and reproduces colonial arrangements in new forms. And so those are things that we have to be aware of when we're talking about, the extractivism and post-extractive economy within and around indigenous communities in the United States, and probably more generally in North America, moving into Canada, who are governed by different kinds of laws. So I don't want to generalize all the way into Canada, but to say some of these dynamics repeat themselves there. Entanglements complicate what we know of ideas of development, resource curse, and dependency, how we think about tribal government and tribal communities' efforts to develop. It's not only about revenues, but also over time, people develop a sense of livelihood and self-identity with these industries. So the previous speaker had talked about ranching and how ranching creates a cultural response, and how people will even want to ranch dry lands because of how they identify themselves as ranchers. And the same thing is true among coal mining communities and coal workers who have spent the better part of their lives in these industries and have identified themselves as these workers and are part of the political response to, and part of the political challenge for governments, and especially small local governments, trying to move out of these extractive industries. So those are some of the things that we have to consider, are kind of the local cultures that have developed around these industries. We can think about it in the Navajo Nation around coal, but we can also think about it in other places throughout the world, like in Appalachia, where where coal mining culture has become a big part of people's and communities' identities in these areas as well. The other thing is, like, when we're thinking toward the post-extractivism, we can look at what indigenous activists and organizers are doing right now to define that terrain. And they're redefining, in the instance of indigenous actors in the United States, they're redefining what sovereignty and self-determination means and looks like to move beyond these ideas of development, these ideas of revenues and resources, and to try to incorporate an understanding of sovereignty that is inclusive of land and the health and sustainability of economic activities on the land, and that also emphasize kinship relationships with other people, with not only Native people, but people around neighboring communities, and also non-human entities that are on the earth that are impacted by human activities. And we can think about the different species of animals that are impacted by damming or by coal or an extraction, and also by roads and all of these other things. And so those are the things that we have to start to incorporate into our thinking about when we move into a post-extractivist economy and landscape. And so those are the things that indigenous activists and organizers are articulating right now. And so these are some of the points that I want to emphasize here. Because I'm in geography, I'm going to supply some maps. This is a map that I got from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, And you can see where exactly, spatially, how exactly, I should say, coal and land and the land basis of tribes start to overlap, and how they produce these kinds of entanglements that I described a moment earlier. So in the Navajo Nation, which is, can you see my cursor right now? I'm going to use a cursor as a pointer. So the Navajo Nation is here in the southwestern part of the United States. And this is a large known coal reserves in the Southwest. And then also in the, where I looked at in the center of the Navajo Nation, you can't see it right now because of the color, the color of purple or gray right on top of each other. But that's where known coal reserves overlap with tribal lands. And you can see that this is the case you know, for the Crow and the Northern Cheyenne in the northern part of the plains of the U.S. and elsewhere throughout the United States. And so that's where these kinds of overlaps happen, and spatially, that's how they overlap. And then we also see where oil and natural gas known reserves are found, and how they also overlap with the known reservation boundaries. And these create tensions. They create not only tensions for bust in the case of coal, you know, there's been decades of mining activities within these reservations, and these reservations have become incorporated into that kind of energy production. And then once it collapses, indigenous people feel that the hardest, but then also pressures of development and pressures, especially for oil and gas pipelines that we've been seeing a lot of protests around in the last couple of years, including Standing Rock, which has been impacted by the development of the Bakken oil shale in North Dakota and South Dakota. And so this is where the Standing Rock Reservation is, and where a lot of those pressures to try to maintain their sovereign treaty rights, despite oil developers and pipeline construction developers moving over and around the official reservation boundaries that exist today. And there's a whole history to that I won't get into here. And then here you can see how that energy infrastructure goes around and through tribal lands. And that's also part of the pressures that are impacting tribal communities, and especially places that are remote and have high unemployment rates. It becomes a lucrative source of monies and jobs and opportunities. It also creates racial tensions between construction crews who come on site to develop these pipelines, who come near the reservation, who set up man camps, who are impacting the Native women in the area, and contributing to missing indigenous women who are somehow lured into these man camps or become part of that economy, and then are not seen from again and are presumed murdered or missing. And so these are real tensions that are happening right now in these areas, and some of the social consequences for indigenous people of these kinds of activities, and things that we need to think about. Now, I created this simple table to understand how federal Indian policy contributes to these development trajectories within Indian country. And so we see different kinds of acts within US law, some of which we were talking about in the previous presentation, and they incentivize a certain kind of development within Indian communities and within tribal reservation lands. And so these are things that make it easier. These are laws that make it easier for tribes to do this kind of activity over other kinds of development activities they might want to do. And that's why a lot of tribes have become entangled within extractive industries. So it's been incentivized, in short, through the federal Indian policy process. And you can see on the right-hand corner the actual laws and acts that have defined how sovereignty exists within these tribes and among these tribal governments. And then on the left, the kinds of development approaches that correspond with those policies. And so you start to develop, especially after the 1930s, these larger notions of tribal governments that centralize the governing power of tribes within a government, who can then lease lands on behalf of the entire population or in half of the entire reservation to outside companies who want to do certain kinds of extraction within these communities. And those, in the way that those lands become leased are defined in these laws, like the Indian Mineral Leasing Act, the Indian Self-Determination Act, and the recently amended Indian Energy Development and Self-Determination Act. So they give the tribal government certain kind of authorities to lease lands for these kinds of activities. And one of the paradoxes that we find within the Navajo Nation in particular is that it's easier for the tribal government to go through the process of leasing land for this kind of development than it is for a member of the Navajo Nation to get land to build a home on, to get a home site lease to build a home on. So it shows you what kinds of land use policies that the federal government is incentivizing. And I think that goes back into this larger narrative that has established the laws that we're talking about in the previous presentation to develop the West and saw the West as a certain kind of a repository of resources, and it's part of a larger ideology beyond just the scope of the law and the practice of the law. It's a mindset and a mentality for people out in the West, and that's how they think about their lands and resources. It's a framework that they start to internalize. So the question about post-extractivism, that is the basis of this conversation. So what is the Navajo Nation going to do now that this power plant's going to close, now that there's all of these terrible consequences from this particular example of a post-extractive economy? Well, people are talking about tourism and other kinds of industries, so they want to replace coal dollars with other kinds of dollars. And that's the immediate fix. That's the immediate thing people are talking about. They're also talking about energy transition. So staying within the energy development game, but doing things that are sustainable. So they want to be parts of the solution for climate change. And this is especially a popular narrative for indigenous actors and non-governmental organizations who have put forward, and in this table I can show you examples of alternative proposals. So these are the actual proposals over time to replace coal or replace other kinds of unsustainable development with these kinds of with solar fields or with wind technology, or even small forms of businesses like Weavers Co-op or in sheep herding, which speak to our traditional economies in the Navajo Nation on the land. And I have me and my colleague Dana Powell wrote an article about some of these politics of transition and alternative energies within the Navajo Nation in the citation there. So that's I'm trying to manage these things at the same time. That's the nature of the transition conversation right now. And then there's people who are moving beyond that to think about fundamentally challenging how we think about modernity, how we think about ourselves as Dene people, and whether or not we even want to be within a quote unquote economy or within the United States, or be part of these communities and networks and energy infrastructures, or if we want to move towards a more abstract idea of decolonization. So things that are moving away from all of those technologies that I described just now, and toward traditional, almost 100% traditional activities like sheep herding or rug making or other kinds of local or small scale agriculture. That was the other thing. And so using the resources toward that kind of lifestyle, and to be more sustainable and to live directly off of the land without having to import things from abroad, from like the lithium that we were talking about in the previous slide, other kinds of minerals that are still part of the modern economy and about our modern lifestyles, and to move towards something different. And so that's, that's a looser idea. That's something that is a little bit vaguer, but that's a notion that some people are talking about too. And I wanted to highlight that. So those are the things that are under conversation right now in a post-extractivism economy within the Navajo Nation and in other indigenous communities. And these are the kinds of problems that we face today. So these are the main points that I wanted to relate for this conversation. And I'm happy to answer whatever immediate questions people have.
Uh, Hi. Well, thank you so much, Professor Curley, for the wonderful presentation. I think you're bringing up many important elements into the table, including a more critical lens into post-extractivism as we think about this concept of entangled colonial structures with indigeneity. And I think this is a very important discussion to have. So is there any questions from you, from other panelists, or? I would like, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you so much. And Dr. Curley, I heard about your lecture over at Dartmouth, so I think I forwarded your name on to maybe to Yvonne, I'm not sure, or to Jeff, but I'm so glad to have heard your talk and to meet you in this format. And I just wanted to, I don't know, my mind's kind of like going in a million directions because there was so much synergy, I think, between our subjects, but I just wrote this article about Indigenous environmental stewardship, and I know that for Indigenous peoples, it's hard to generalize, but you know, the compartmentalization that European Americans use to like categorize things as being like an environmental law or a cultural resource preservation law has been like another aspect of colonialism that has been sort of like, it's a framework that we've placed onto this discussion about different subjects like mineral extraction and natural resource use that is maybe even not a valid starting point for that conversation. So I don't know, you just got me thinking about like, so my article was about how federalism and the whole notion of like granting power from Congress to a tribe like the Navajo Nation to regulate its own air quality is just this continuation of the colonialist framework that, you know, started basically after the Constitution was ratified and the Indian Commerce Clause was kind of defined in the way that it was by the Supreme Court. And so I don't know, I think maybe it's a longer conversation that I might want to have with you at some point, but I guess have you thought about, you know, organic ways, specific ways of, I mean, I guess you talked about some of this, but of I don't want to say regulating, but just like developing sort of organic ideas about natural resource use within tribal communities. And do you think that needs to come from each community, or is there a way to maybe have like a broader conversation?
Yeah, I think that this is an excellent question, and I get that it's hard to grasp. You know, there's this tension because there's a real tension between like giving tribes certain kinds of authorities, but also knowing that tribes are dominated by the power and the need for the power of these large transnational corporations who are on Indian lands developing these kinds of resources, and also, you know, the money and necessity for these kinds of jobs that are involved. And so there's that kind of tension where you want to regulate, you want to preserve the earth and the resources and make a healthy communities, but then also like jobs and development and all these other kinds of things become part of the drive towards having a laxer type of regulation. So there's an inherent tension, and I think indigenous environmental organizations are sometimes skeptical of some of the way our own tribal government regulates these things, with the way our Navajo Nation our environmental protection agency, our Navajo Nation EPA, regulates these things, especially around coal, because coal was such a dominant economy. Uranium is a different thing because uranium, you know, there's a large political consensus that uranium was bad for the Navajo people historically and into today because of the radioactive nature of uranium. So anyway, so there's that tension. We have passed a couple of laws in the Navajo Nation. We have our own environmental laws, but then we have something called the fundamental laws, and within that, we're trying to define a relationship between humans and nature that are different from from narratives of domination that are part of the development and modernization ideologies to ones of reciprocity and kinship, which is part of our historic traditions. and I think there's overlap between tribal communities within the U.S., where even though we might have different words for this or different language and terms for this, we have similar ideas at work. And so these are areas where we can find overlap. And then we in 2005, we passed the Dene Natural Resource Protection Act, which is what effectively or officially banned uranium mining in the Navajo Nation. And in that, we started to use Dene concepts. The concept at that time was Dil Na Ye Da, which is like, you're not supposed to bring this stuff from the earth. You're not supposed to extract this stuff from the earth, which was funny to me because now there's a rhetoric in environmental justice campaigns that are saying, keep it in the ground. And we already have a concept that says the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And it's already in our laws. So that's an interesting area and overlap. So anyway, I think we should have a larger conversation about this somewhere in the future for sure. But that's what I saw.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I think that's the idea is kind of putting our thinking together about these very complex issues. And I think I feel very fortunate for this opportunity to listen to you both, and I mean, it's opening up a door for future conversation and engagement about these issues. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So our next presenter is Dr. Jem Preston. Dr. Jem Preston is currently a research associate at the Roberts Center for Canadian Studies at York University. And she's a facilitator with the SANIA's Indigenous Cultural Safety Training Program. Her research examines white settler colonialism and tar sands extraction. And her work has been published in race and class and cultural studies journals, among others. So thank you so much, Dr. Preston, for joining us today. And please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me and for the two previous presenters. This is really great. And I see so many interconnections between our work, which is really, really interesting to think about. I come from a critical race background, so my orientation to these questions is a little bit different. I'm not from, I don't have a background in economics or law or geography, but the question that comes up for me in relation to how do we move beyond extractivism is intimately tied to questions about race and colonialism and moving beyond ongoing colonialism and white supremacy. So I understand extractivism, especially, I mean, it's a different context here in Canada than in the States, but especially the types of extractivism where Indigenous communities in particular can't say no, essentially. So understanding extractivism in this context, part of ongoing colonial processes of dispossession and exploitation, and as a central part of racial capitalism. So one thing that I wanted to do today, I'm happy the previous presenter mentioned man camps and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I wanted to, this past Monday, I don't know, some of you probably know, but the final report of the Canadian National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was released on Monday. And that report is entitled Reclaiming Power and Place. And so I want to draw a bit from that report in my comments today, and just to acknowledge the work also of the Indigenous communities who shared so much in order to make this report possible, and also in order to come to a really amazing place, I think, politically in Canada, where what's happening to Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people is being named as genocide, which is something that I wanted to talk a little bit about today. That report has a specific section in it on resource extraction and its relationships to this ongoing genocide. So, the report states that genocide is the sum of the social practices, assumptions, and actions detailed in the report. And so many of the witnesses expressed that Canada is at war and that Indigenous girls, women, and us LGBTQIA people are under siege. So with that, holding that in mind, I want to start by tracing the connections that I see between settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and extractivism, because I think of them in close relationship to each other. I'm then going to provide a little bit of historical context about the Athabasca region and tar sands extraction, the treaty process there and its relationship to the oil and gas sector. And then from there, that's going to help us get a better look at the contemporary situation and how we can think about the future from understanding the past and the present a bit more. The future visions, I guess, that I'm thinking about and drawing from here, because I'm a white settler, are primarily articulated by Indigenous people who are impacted by resource extraction. So that's where I'll sort of end off. So I work with the concept of racial capitalism, which was theorized by Cedric Robinson, who wrote a book in 1983 called Black Marxism. And there he traces pre-capitalist development of racial taxonomies or race thinking and in the West. And he fundamentally troubles Marxist historiographies of capitalism as emerging kind of with this race-free revolutionary possibility. So he locates racialism as pre-capitalist and even pre-mercantilist and as central to the modern world system. So he's foregrounding trajectories of racial ordering in Western epistemologies, where slavery, violence, colonialism, imperialism, and genocide were all rationalized through that. So tracing the Black radical tradition and the long history of Black-led liberation movements, Robinson developed this concept of racial capitalism because it centers race as an organizing principle of economic order. So I work with that framework as well. So race as an organizing principle of economic order. It's key to my understanding of extractivism. So in contemporary neoliberal societies like Canada, that means that race is already present. It's already determining the value of bodies, and indirectly it's determining the value of land itself and the orientation to land. So the idea of racial extractivism then positions race and colonialism as central to extractivist projects under neoliberalism. And it underpins how the epistemologies were written into the economic structure and social relations of production and consumption. So racial extractivism, the idea is that it can acknowledge a multitude of ways in which colonial histories and reiterations of race-based epistemologies inform the practices used by the oil and gas industry, for example, and by the Canadian white settler government in promoting and managing resource extraction and that industry specifically. So I want to talk a little bit about the Canadian context specifically, which is a bit different, but very similar and interconnected, obviously, to the American context. But the particular form of colonialism at work here and in the US is white settler colonialism. So white by virtue of white supremacist foundations of, in Canada, French and British colonialisms, and the modern colonial and liberal epistemology that underpins the colonial missions and the wealth that the empires were able to amass. So this is, you can see this through the doctrine of discovery, the papal bulls, the concept, the way that even the concept of the human is developed, right? It's a race-based colonial model. So similarly, the formation of the ideal Canadian subject was imagined within that context, where the British Empire was supporting the creation of the Canadian state based on British ideals developed through racially ordered colonial encounters. So this historical violence gets obscured through national narratives of white pioneering bravery, of overcoming wild, untamed nature, empty land, these ideas. And then later narratives that include sort of a benevolent state and a benevolent multicultural state that's sort of seen as free from racism, or it's set against the United States as less racist somehow, which it's not. So these same accounts of Canadian history structure the narratives about tar sands extraction as well. So there are narratives about white pioneers, Sidney Ellis and Dr. Carl Clark, and the narratives are the same. They you know, tame nature in order to convert it into a profitable resource. So those narratives were operating also during the time that Treaties 8 and 6 were signed. So Treaties 8 and 6, I want to just like share a bit of the historical context of those two treaty agreements that cover the Athabasca region. So, you know, the fur trade in Canada, you know, began in and around the 1530s on the East Coast. But the impacts of that didn't really reach the Athabasca region until the 19th century, when the Canadian states institutions began were being established, and they began securing resources through signing treaties. That was the goal. So the Geological Survey of Canada played a significant role in motivating the treaty-making process once the presence of oil and bitumen was confirmed. And at the same time, the Klondike Gold Rush prompted an influx of white settlement, unregulated white settlement into the area. So Indigenous communities were making pleas to the government at that time regarding this like unregulated white settlement. But those pleas were largely ignored unless a treaty was already in place. So this was the case, particularly when hunting and trapping grounds were disturbed by settlers, or in the prairie region with the buffalo population being decimated by white settlers, leading to mass starvation, Indigenous starvation. So early European explorers of the Athabasca region recorded the presence of oil deposits. They were confirmed by the Geological Survey of Canada in 1870. And then, you know, tests began to be done on whether or not, how it could be extracted, transported, and sold. So this process is what brought about the Treaty 8 process. So at this point, the white settler colonial project was, you know, deeply informed by these myths of terra nullius, and they ignored Indigenous sovereignty, obviously. There were narratives that Indigenous people were unable to self-govern and unable to properly use the land. So land use and European ideologies of property not only motivated the sort of resourcification of Indigenous territories then and now, but also informed the racialization of Indigenous people as lazy, unable to be productive in the economy or in white settler society more generally. So Treaty 8 followed the precedent of other numbered treaties, and it was written in advance of any consultation with communities. So its boundaries were decided by the commissioners themselves. It was largely written before any consultation. The treaty had previously been set based on the commissioners' limited knowledge of Indigenous communities in another region in the prairies. So it was based on completely different lifestyles and needs, completely different communities. And the terms and conditions were based off of Treaty 7, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Treaty 6 was signed in 1876, and James Dashuk describes that process as basically happening under duress because they entered into negotiation with little bargaining power, Indigenous communities did, and it was under the control or under the conditions of mass starvation. So in attempting to clear the plains of Indigenous people, Canadian officials used the denial of food, the withholding of food, to force nations into treaty negotiations, which then cleared a path for the Canadian Pacific Railway, which was largely built by Chinese migrant labor. So that allowed for more efficient racial extractivism and increased white settlement. So Treaty 8 built upon earlier treaty-making tactics, and it was signed in 1899. And it was presented to the people of the Athabasca region as a necessity. So settlement and extraction would go ahead regardless, but the commissioners promised that the treaty was a way to ensure that they retained some protections guaranteed in advance. So testing of bitumen samples continued by the Geological Survey of Canada, and soon oil and gas producers in the US, in the Houston area, began to hear about the deposits, and so interest grew in the region and in its potential profitability. So that's a bit of history. I'm trying to go really quickly, but if we jump forward to today, the scale of the Athabasca, Cold Lake, and Peace River bitumen extraction projects is, very hard to convey. It's massive. And similarly, I do think it's important to actually go, similar to the other presenters, it's really important to go to these places, to these sites, and see the scale, like experience the scale, because the bitumen producing zone in the Athabasca region contains about 175 billion barrels of proven reserves. So it makes it the single largest pile of hydrocarbons outside of Saudi Arabia. The tailings ponds, they're not ponds, they're like huge lakes. You can't see the other side of many of them. They're unlined, they're just open. And the machinery, for example, used to remove tar sands, it's an in situ process. These heavy haulers, they're capable of hauling up to 300 tons at a time. So it's massive scale. The sites make up just this vast industrial wasteland that's visible from space. And it was once boreal forest there. So that, along with the tailings lakes, the surface mining, it just looks like a moonscape, basically. Pipelines then, of course, are crossing everywhere. They disrupt caribou migration patterns. They disturb generations old Métis and First Nations trap lines. And they, of course, sometimes burst and leach toxins into the earth. And thinking about colonial entanglements, that the previous speaker was talking about, these pipelines are obviously crossing borders, and I think it's like 98% of tar sands oil is going to the States. So we're very interconnected here talking about these topics. So this region is home to many Indigenous communities, including Cree, Chipewyan, Prairie Dene, Métis nations, and is represented by First Nations band councils, the Métis Nation of Alberta, multiple tribal councils, and then numerous traditional governments. So there's also, in some areas when we talk about consent around these projects, there's a difference between band council consent and traditional government consent for projects. So there's other complicated dynamics there around representation. So the majority settler community at Fort McMurray has a population that has increased on average by about 8% per year. So it's about 125% population growth since 2000. So this is a boom town, right? This is sort of the description of a boom town. The figures don't account also for the majority of the Canadian tar sands laborers who do not permanently live in Fort McMurray. So it's a fly-in, fly-out economy. So you fly in, you do your shifts, you fly out. there aren't relationships to the place, to the people, to the indigenous communities there that would help create any kind of accountability, for example. It also doesn't account for temporary foreign workers who are primarily racialized people who were brought in to do most of the low pay labor that's associated with mass extraction. So considering this, if we think about the report that was released on Monday, the families of the survivors of murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls consistently refer to 4 general ways that their experiences were rooted in colonialism. So this is across First Nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives. The 4 pathways that maintain colonial violence are identified in the report as historical, multi-generational, and intergenerational trauma, social and economic marginalization, maintaining the status quo and institutional lack of will, and ignoring the agency and expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. So understanding the crisis of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people as one based in key relationships provides a new way to look at how systems, structures, policies, and people work to target Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. So when we think about the key to relationships, the importance of relationships in this context, and when you think about man camps and the fly-in, fly-out economy, you can start seeing the kinds of colonial violence that is being perpetuated by this industry. So the inquiry, the national inquiry, was also provided with a report from the Women's Earth Alliance and the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, which documented, quote, how extractive industries can affect the health and safety of Indigenous women and children. It discusses several examples of physical and sexual assaults against Indigenous women and girls by transient workers in extractive industries. And the report includes the following statement from Melina Libucan-Massimo, who is a woman of the Lubicon Cree First Nation and a very vocal anti-tar sands leader. And she says, the industrial system of resource extraction in Canada is predicated on systems of power and domination. This system is based on the raping and pillaging of Mother Earth, as well as violence against women. The two are inextricably linked. With the expansion of extractive industries, not only do we see the desecration of the land, we see an increase in violence against women. Rampant sexual violence against women and a variety of social ills result from the influx of transient workers in and around workers' camps. So other reports also discuss the relationship between crime rates and resource extraction, including physical and sexual assault of Indigenous women by transient workers or those in the man camps. So adverse impacts to the community safety and crime levels as a result of resource development activities have been well documented in Canada, but also throughout the world. There's increases in crime levels, drug and alcohol related offenses, sexual offenses, domestic and gang violence, as well as, these are all things linked to boomtown economies and man camps. Other significant factors that relate to this violence beyond just the man camps include Indigenous women's low participation in the extractive economy, coupled with the rising cost of living. So this can result in extreme economic insecurity for Indigenous women, placing them at risk of being targeted for violence. So in the report, Connie Grey Eyes told the National Inquiry that many Indigenous women in northern British Columbia, for example, remain in abusive relationships because they are economically dependent on their spouse. So these are just some of the additional ripple effects that we see from this resource extraction, these particular sites of resource extraction. So the report notes that families and survivors also pointed to relationships as opportunities for learning, understanding, and transformation. So words, actions, and behaviors that condone violence tell us something about the attitudes and values that shape relationships. These relationships, based on underlying or systemic beliefs, translate into troubling day-to-day realities in the lives of Métis, Inuit, and First Nations women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. To make lasting change to these relationships requires confronting the underlying or systemic beliefs that allow that violence to happen, end quote. So that's a quote from the executive summary of the report. So when we think about confronting those underlying systems and beliefs, it's central to envisioning a post-extractivist future, right? These are questions and issues that we have to consider when we're thinking about a future that is going to work. It's a first step to name genocide as genocide, which is one thing that this report does, but also, in work in and analysis of resource extraction sites, to name also systemic racism that exists there, ongoing colonialism and the role that that plays within the industry, and white supremacy as an organizing principle of this economy. So my research examines the ways that colonial white supremacist ways of thinking guide the oil and gas industry's approach to relationships with Indigenous people, communities, and nations, and how this way of thinking is central to how the industry is also securitized. So the security apparatuses that accompany oil and gas sector specifically, and also how they impact how that industry is marketed. And in Canada, I can talk about it another time, but there's ideas that Canadian oil is somehow ethical, right? Ethical oil, as opposed to, oil from Saudi Arabia, oil from Sudan, which is this like very racialized distinction is made that's part of these colonial relationships, both like within Canada, but also globally. So I'll leave it at that for now, but thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Preston. It was a very rich presentation, a lot of elements there. And it makes me think about Arturo Escobar, who is an anthropologist from Colombia. He coins this term, the ontological occupation of the territory, because as you have shown us today, there are a lot of elements and what economists call externalities that kind of affects ways of being, ways of inhabiting place, ways of relating with one another, and not just the economic side of things. So I think you're bringing a lot of elements, this idea of racial capitalism, the issue of genocide as it is connected to extractivist practices, and also the racialization of work, but also the feminization of externalities, because we see that most of the effects of these extractive industries affect women's bodies, and especially Indigenous women. So thank you so much for bringing this into the table. I think it's a lot of elements to keep the conversation ongoing. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for joining us today. I don't know if anybody else have any comments or questions, but if you, Dr. Preston, wanted to expand a little bit more on anything, because I think it's a lot of things there. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that presentation, and I thought that all of these sort of fit together in an interesting way that got my wheels turning even further. And I just wanted to mention that Sarah Deer and Elizabeth Kronk Warner are two Indigenous law professors in the United States who are doing, I think they're writing something, they're definitely researching the a law review or law journal article that's oriented in a similar way to your research about the connection. They sort of draw this connection between the extractive assault on the earth as a parallel to the sexual assaults that are experienced by Indigenous women, especially in the man camps and in the communities that surround those operations. And I can give you, if you want to, I think my email is available through the through Yvonne's organizational skills. So if you want to follow up with me, I'm happy to provide you with their names. And I don't think they've actually written anything yet, but it just might be interesting to talk to them about how they're approaching it.
Mm-hmm, that would be great. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, Carla or Emil, do you guys want to say anything about the presentations? Have any questions, reactions? I think it's a rich kind of set of elements, and I'm really privileged to be able to listen to you and learning about your research. So I think this is a really nice step for conversation.
I just want to quickly say thank you so much for coordinating this, Yvonne, and thank you to the three presenters, although we lost one already. It's been really interesting, and I'll just, we're running out of time, but so a question might not be appropriate, but the question that I have come back constantly in my own thinking around mining from an ecological law perspective is that we really need to turn things around in terms of, and Professor Hoffman talked a little bit about that, what drives mining, and I've been wondering how law can change why we mine, so that it is the real need for the minerals that drives mining, rather than profit of corporations and other colonial interests. So, so my question, for example, to Professor Preston would be like, what would the peoples of the Athabasca, the nations of the Athabasca, need these tar sands minerals for, if anything? And that would be maybe the only reason that these should be extracted. Anyway, I'll leave just that thought because we're at the end of our time. But thank you so much. It was very thought-provoking and interesting.
Yeah, there's pretty widespread opposition to tar sands extraction by Indigenous communities in the Athabasca region. That's part of the problem, and part of the legal problem in Canada is the right of Indigenous communities to say no and their power to say no. So there's a duty to consult, but it doesn't really mean much when you actually can't say no. So, and tar sands, you know, bitumen is not, it's very energy intensive to extract bitumen. And it's very much like an industry created problem. Like it's something in terms of, like, you know, managing oil and gas markets globally. It's the same companies that are extracting from the tar sands that are extracting in the Sudan. It's the same companies. So the ability to, you know, also play this sort of, it's a primarily money-making venture, obviously, right? It's not about how much tar sands oil is actually needed. I think there's a lot of lobbying against renewable energy by those companies, and it's not. I mean, it doesn't make sense to be extracting bitumen. It doesn't, and that's something that Indigenous communities, so many Indigenous communities in that region know and have been so vocally opposing for so long now. And they're the communities that are also, you know, first to be impacted. So there's huge problems with really high aggressive cancer rates, with fish and caribou wildlife also showing signs of aggressive cancer. in the region, and the particulate matter from the in situ process that's poisoning people and animals and the earth. All of these things, are such clear, and just if you see it, it's just so clearly wrong that, yeah, I don't know, that's not much of an answer, but I think there's a lot of vocal no's, but there's some very powerful yeses, right?
Well, I think well, we run out of time. My English is coming out really kind of entangled with my Spanish, I think. So, so thank you, you all, for all your presentations, for the participants to joining us today, and we'll keep in touch. And this presentation is going to be uploaded in the L4E webpage at some point once it's edited. So I'll keep you posted on that as well, and also on future events for the Luang Governance Association and the E4A program. Well, so that's it, and we'll keep you posted on any future developments of this series.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.